The House of Ptolemy, Ptolemaic Dynasty of Ancient Egypt. The Ptolemaic Dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, general of Alexander the Great, ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, creating a powerful and wealthy Hellenistic state. Alexander the Great conquered Persian-controlled Egypt in 332 during his campaigns against the Achaemenid Empire. After his death in 323 before Christ, Alexander's territories were divided among his closest companions, the Diadochi. One of his generals, Ptolemy, faced other members of the Diadocos. Eventually he gained control of Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. The rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty adopted the title of pharaoh and commissioned many public monuments of themselves in an Egyptian style of dress to gain legitimacy and the support of native Egyptians. In many other respects, the rulers maintained many of their Hellenistic traditions, often at the expense of the Egyptians. The Ptolemies insisted on the primacy of Greek within their empire while at the same time skillfully placing themselves at the center of Egyptian society and religious life to ensure their rule. In the following centuries, Egypt, especially the new capital at Alexandria, became a nexus of Hellenistic culture and emerged as the richest and strongest of Alexander's successor states. Rise of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. After Alexander's death in 323 before Christ, a power struggle emerged between his seconds in command. Ptolemy was appointed satrap of Egypt by Perdiccas, who ruled as regent on behalf of Alexander's invalid half-brother Philip III of Macedon. As Alexander the Great's empire crumbled, Ptolemy soon established himself as a ruler in his own right, defending Egypt from the advances of Perdiccas and other generals fighting for control of Alexander's empire. In 305 before Christ, Ptolemy emerged victorious, assuming the titles of king and pharaoh and changing his name to Ptolemy I Soter. All men after him adopted the name Ptolemy, and women, princesses and queens, preferred Cleopatra, Arsinoe or Berenice. A revival of Egyptian religious and cultural customs came very early under the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy I respected these customs, although the early Ptolemies did not actually participate in them. During the reign of Ptolemy II, more Egyptian customs were adopted, such as marriage between royal brothers according to the myth of Osiris. He also began the tradition of participating in Egyptian religious life, such as building and rebuilding temples and becoming involved in the priesthood. In the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, Egypt was the richest and most powerful of the states conquered by Alexander. About 100 years later, complications surrounding the throne and foreign attacks weakened the kingdom, forcing it to increasingly depend on the Roman Republic. Under Cleopatra VII, who attempted to restore Ptolemaic power, Egypt fought a battle with Rome. Ultimately, this led to the country's downfall. Egypt became one of Rome's richest provinces and Alexandria remained of utmost importance until the Middle Ages. Administration and society. The Greeks were a minority in Egypt, but they were a privileged minority. Their influence spread throughout the country, creating an educated Greco-Egyptian class separate from the native Egyptian majority. Greek citizens were the only ones who could hold positions of power in government and society. They also received a traditional Greek education, married within their own community, and operated under Greek law. There was no major movement to assimilate the Greeks into Egyptian culture. As time went by, some Egyptians who learned Greek managed to progress. In fact, many self-identified Greeks were of Egyptian descent. This resulted in an emerging bilingual and multicultural social class. However, the vast majority of Egyptians enjoyed few benefits as wealth, power, and influence remained predominantly in the hands of the Greeks. The Ptolemaic dynasty faced several external threats from the Seleucid Empire to the east. Not only were these conflicts costly, but the Ptolemies also recruited Egyptians into their army. Existing as second-class citizens in their own country, being forcibly drafted to fight in other people's wars, and financing these battles with higher taxes obviously did not sit well with the Egyptians and caused discontent that occasionally erupted into revolts against the powers that be. Egyptian nationalism reached its peak during the reign of Ptolemy IV Philopator, 221–205 before Christ, when a self-proclaimed native pharaoh, Hugronefer, gained control over a nome and ruled there for several years until his death in 199 before Christ. His son, Enquenefer, took his father's place and continued to rule until he was subjugated by Ptolemy V Epiphanes around 186 before Christ. Of course, the Egyptians' grievances were never resolved and became the basis for future revolts under the Ptolemaic Dynasty. Ptolemaic religion. Despite administrative and cultural changes, Ptolemaic rulers did not force Egyptians to alter their own culture and belief systems. On the contrary, they actively supported traditional Egyptian religious forms and practices. In the early years, temple designs continued by new kings and officials were modeled after Egyptian styles. In later years, the Ptolemies beautified previously existing temples, which is why many existing temples in Egypt are technically Ptolemaic constructions. With Ptolemaic support, these temples became centers of learning. We see evidence of the growth of cults, to Osiris, Isis, and Horus, temple statues, offerings of animal mummies, creation of reliefs and busts and public celebration of festivals. As is expected when two cultures collide, the Ptolemies introduced some of their own worship practices to Egypt. Ptolemy I created a new god, Serapis, a combination of Egyptian and Greek gods, in an attempt to mix elements of Greek and Egyptian religion so that the Ptolemies could be accepted as rulers. To achieve this goal, the Ptolemies also adopted the tradition of declaring themselves living gods. The queens of the Ptolemaic dynasty also received praise and attention. The queen and pharaoh Arsinoe II, wife of Ptolemy II, was often represented in the form of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, but she wore the crown of Lower Egypt. The look was completed with ram's horns, ostrich feathers and other traditionally Egyptian markers of royalty and deification. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic line, was often shown with features of Isis, including a small throne or a solar disk between two horns as a headdress. Ptolemaic women were quite active in the religious sphere, indicating that they had access to some type of education, as they were required to read music and texts. That said, it was mainly upper-class women who received the best and most holistic education. Some exceptions came from merchants who taught their daughters skills such as painting, writing, science, and mathematics. Queens usually held almost as much power as kings, and sometimes their powers were equal. The Ptolemaic dynasty re-established the Egyptian practice of marrying siblings, and kings and queens ruled together. In fact, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II were designated as pharaohs and had considerable power over the empire. Art and culture. The Library of Alexandria, founded by Ptolemy I between 300 to 290 before Christ, was originally dedicated to the Nine Muses, the famous Greek goddesses of the arts, who were of great importance in ancient Greek culture. The institution became an important center of academic, literary, and scientific research that attracted many of the leading Greek scholars from across the Hellenistic world. Unfortunately, no primary accounts document the destruction of the library. This led to the formation of several theories surrounding its end. Some speculate that it was demolished in a fire that started when Julius Caesar burned the Egyptian fleet during the siege of Alexandria in 48 before Christ, or when the powerful Caliph of Mecca in the 7th century AD incinerated it. Others believe that Emperor Theodosius set fire to the library, or that it was destroyed during Aurelian's recapture of Alexandria during the revolt of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra in 269 before Christ. It remains a mystery. Initially, the iconographic styles of Greek and Egyptian art remained segregated, but over time the characteristics began to merge. The persistence of the Egyptian art style highlights the Ptolemies' commitment to maintaining Egyptian customs to create acceptance of their rule and satisfaction for native Egyptians. The two busts pictured above and below provide excellent examples of the differences between Greek and Egyptian artwork. The image above is a small head created by the Ptolemies and is believed to represent Arsinoe II. The headdress and double uraeus are classically Egyptian, and the shapes of the eyebrows and slanted eyes are specifically reminiscent of the 30th dynasty, the last of the pharaonic dynasties. The Ptolemaic dynasty made great efforts to align itself with the latter dynasty and initially continued to build designs and works of art in this form so that they would be seen as the natural successors to the throne. It should be mentioned, however, that the queens of Dynasty 30 were virtually unknown, indicating that even at this early point, Ptolemaic queens served a more prominent royal role than many of their predecessors. Next we have a marble bust of a Ptolemaic queen, probably also Arsinoe II. The hair and idealized facial features in this portrait are classically styled. In fact, it is believed that the bust may be modeled after classical images of Hera and Demeter. It is evident that the early Ptolemies emphasized different aspects of Arsinoe, but both deified her as a goddess. There is a plethora of evidence for the fusion of Greco-Egyptian art through depictions of this queen. We generally see the incorporation of Egyptian iconography in his striding pose, the pillar behind his back, and the cornucopia in his hand, while his hairstyle and facial features also show Greek influences. Generally speaking, this artistic fusion portrayed women as younger in appearance, while men ranged from idealistic to realistic. Greek influence can clearly be seen in the emphasis on individual characteristics, e.g. hairstyles, oval face, round eyes, and small mouth. Decline and fall of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. The end of the Ptolemaic period coincided with the rise of the Roman Republic. By this time, Ptolemaic power had been significantly reduced due to external conflicts, due to the Seleucids and other threats, as well as the Ptolemies' near-constant plots to dethrone and/or assassinate each other. They had little choice but to ally with the Romans. Approximately a century and a half later, by the time of Ptolemy XII, Rome had firm control over Egypt, and its power strongly influenced Egyptian politics and its possessions to the point that the Roman Senate established guardianship over the Ptolemaic dynasty. After a series of coup attempts, Ptolemy XII expressed his desire for Cleopatra VII to marry his brother, Ptolemy XIII. He called for them to rule together in his will, with the Senate named as executor, thus giving Rome even more control over the Ptolemies and consequently over Egypt as a country. After the death of Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII ascended the throne and married. However, Cleopatra was stripped of her power shortly afterwards, causing her to flee into exile. There, she would begin planning her own coup with the support of none other than Julius Caesar himself. Julius Caesar came to Alexandria in 48 before Christ to help end the nationalist-inspired war in Egypt. As the country was Rome's main supplier of grain and other goods, a war with Egypt would have caused serious damage to Rome and its citizens. Cleopatra was smuggled to him in secret, and he agreed to support her claim to the throne. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors fled the palace and turned the guards against his sister, forcing her to barricade herself within the palace walls until Roman reinforcements could arrive. Cleopatra then married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and soon after received the title of pharaoh. She and Caesar became lovers and had a son named Caesar Ion. Of course, Caesar was assassinated in 44 before Christ and Rome was divided between those who supported Mark Antony and those who supported Octavian. Cleopatra chose Mark Antony and eventually he also became her lover and they married in 32 before Christ and had 3 children. Unfortunately for them, this marriage was never officially recognized in Rome, as Mark Antony was already married to Octavia Minor, who was none other than Octavian's sister. As you can probably imagine, this did not please Octavian. Rome was never known for its equal treatment of women, who were literally categorized as second-class citizens. Then, when Roman leaders accused Cleopatra of seducing Mark Antony to further her conquest of Rome, support for both fell sharply. Taking advantage of falling public opinion, Octavian declared war on his opponents and, in 31 before Christ, defeated them at the Battle of Actium. Octavian waited a year before claiming Egypt as a Roman province and then marched to Alexandria to confront Antony and Cleopatra. Antonio knew he would be executed, so he chose to take his own life by falling on his sword. In ancient classical customs, it was not a moral offense to commit suicide, this only emerged with the advent of Christianity. Cleopatra knew she would be taken to Rome to be paraded through the streets to symbolize Octavian's victory, so she too chose to end her life on August 12, 30 before Christ. Most of us have heard the famous story of Cleopatra dying from a poisonous asp sting, but there's really no way to prove or disprove this tale without more evidence. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian ordered the execution of her teenage son and heir, Caesar Ion. He was intercepted during his escape and killed by Roman soldiers. With the deaths of Cleopatra and Caesar Ion, the Ptolemaic Dynasty and Pharaonic Egypt came to an end. Alexandria remained the nation's capital, but Egypt was annexed to Rome and Octavian became sole ruler of Rome, changing his name to Caesar Augustus. This began the process of transforming Rome into a monarchy, the Roman Empire. So, What did you think of today's video? Did you already know any of these facts about the Ptolemaic dynasty? What impressed you most? Let us know your thoughts on this topic, as we would love to respond to your comments below. And if you liked this video and haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss any of the intriguing videos we post every week. And if you want to take advantage and learn a little more, be sure to click on one of these videos that we are suggesting for you. Until the next video.